Great. So again, welcome to all of you today. Before I introduce our speaker, I just wanted to briefly explain the structure of our webinar today. Tom is going to be exploring practical ways in which teachers and teacher assistants in international schools can support vocabulary development to ensure that our multilingual learners are able to meaningfully participate in our curriculum and through all aspects of school, whether that's social and academic. And as well as considering the connection between vocabulary development and academic attainment, he is also going to provide us with some guidelines in terms of how to identify some of the key vocabulary that we need to teach within our curriculum, and then some practical ways of how to do that, some strategies for that as well. So if there's, again, time at the end of the webinar for questions, we will take those, put them up in the question and answer function on Zoom. And tomorrow, all of you will be emailed a video recording of the webinar, and with some links to some of the resources. So enough from me right now. I would like to introduce our speaker today, presenter Tom Beeks. He joined the Bell Foundation in 2020, and Tom has worked in language education since 2003 and has taught in China, Japan, Ecuador, and North Africa. His main areas of interests are teaching young learners, project-based learning, and teacher development. He holds an MA in anthropological linguistics and is CELTA and Delta qualified. He has worked as a teacher trainer in the UK and abroad, and is a regular speaker at English language teaching conferences such as International TEFL. So I'll hand it over to you at this time, Tom. Tom, we're unable to hear you. I don't know if you are muted at this point. No, it looks, maybe it's something with your microphone. You're muted now, it shows, but maybe just check the connection with the microphone. There, we can hear you now.
You can hear me now? Okay, yes. Apologies. Hello, everyone. Thank you for the lovely introduction. And yeah, it's great to see so many people here with us from all over the world. Let's go straight into what we're going to do today. Here are our learning intentions for this this session. I'll give you a moment to read those. Okay, and this is how we're going to get there today, and we're going to start off as we always do in Bell webinars, is focusing on the kind of principles and the rationale for what we're doing. So let's have a look at why it is important to teach vocabulary. I hope the reason you're here is you don't need too much convincing, but it's important to look at I think the basis for why we want to help our students do with their vocabulary. And I think the most important point we can make is that language is at the heart of everything. It pervades everything that we do. We know from research that a child's vocabulary at age 5 not only correlates with academic attainment later on, but also with job prospects and even mental health later in life. It's obviously really important for social and emotional development of young people, necessary for communicating with friends, and of course at a secondary level that's vital once you know, at that age the learners are moving away from relating to sort of adults as their main support network to their peers, and joining in school activities, and of course expressing feelings. So overall then, beyond the importance of building vocabulary, we also know from a review of research commissioned by the Bell Foundation back in 2015 that interventions for learners using EAL that are aimed at explicitly teaching vocabulary are particularly successful in terms of pupils' learning in relation to the target vocabulary and also wider literacy-based measures. This study was based on a collection of studies, mainly taken from, I think, the UK and other English-speaking countries, simply because that's where the research for these kind of things gets done. Sadly, there's just not as much research available internationally, but I think a lot of it can be applied. And I think the main message we need to take away from this is that we cannot afford to leave vocabulary development to chance. We need to move away from seeing vocabulary instruction as an addition to the curriculum towards it being an integral part of the curriculum itself. Okay, so let's have a look at some of the principles of vocabulary instruction. Vocabulary development, as we just talked about, happens in all kinds of ways, both inside and outside of the school. So a comprehensive approach to thinking about vocabulary is always going to be the strongest approach. So let's consider what that might look like. And while we do that, I want you to think about your own practice. Okay, so for each element that I introduce in the next couple of slides, I just want you to think about yourself, whether you feel confident about doing this, kind of neutral, or whether you're maybe not so confident in fostering each element. You don't need to share this with anyone. It's purely for yourself, just so you maybe get a better sense of where you need to develop, or where you want to improve in terms of your own practice when it comes to supporting your students. So first, we can develop vocabulary by providing a broad exposure to a variety of texts, both fiction and non-fiction, and different genres, and also from a variety of different sources. And in that, we should include culturally relevant material and texts in learners' first languages too, so that learners can leverage the assets they bring from their homes and communities as a way to connect with the material in English that they're reading too. We also want to promote a wide use of vocabulary by providing abundant opportunities for bilingual learners to use new words in a variety of different contexts and over extended periods of time. From research, we know it can take anywhere from 12 to 15 encounters with a new word for it to be part of one's vocabulary. And if you've ever learned a language, you may be aware of that phenomenon of learning a word in a lesson, and then encountering it maybe a week or two later, on your bus journey to work or something in a different context, and the light bulb goes on. And you're like, I remember that, and that's a really powerful effect. And we want to foster this within both academic and social contexts, encouraging friendships and extracurricular activities as well. Also, in every subject area, I think we really need to develop what we call learners' word consciousness. That's kind of increasing learners' awareness and understanding of and depth of word knowledge, and language knowledge more generally, I guess, so that they can figure out the meanings of vocabulary more independently, and also just to foster, I think, a sense of curiosity and excitement about language. This can happen by teaching learners about the kind of things mentioned in the green box, and we'll come on to some of this in a bit more detail later. We should also expose learners to wide reading, where they are introduced to complex texts, or more, increasingly complex text as they move through their educational career, so that they can start to hear and be exposed to academic vocabulary and begin to integrate these words into their own linguistic repertoire. And also, becoming able to understand when it's appropriate to use different types of academic vocabulary. So selecting brief, engaging texts with high impact academic vocabulary is going to be key here. And we also need to explicitly teach vocabulary, as Murphy's research showed earlier. For this, we need to intentionally plan for vocabulary instruction. We need to know how to select which vocabulary to teach, as well as effective instructional routines, both of which we'll be looking at later in the webinar. Finally, a comprehensive approach means we should value and promote vocabulary development of a child's home language. not only because we want bilingual and plurilingual children who can connect with their families, community, and the wider world, but also because we know that a learner's first language is one of the best resources they have for learning a second language. So they can bring the skills they have in their home language across to their second language, which in this case would be English. So we really should be exploiting that and cultivating the use of all the language resources we have in our classrooms. Okay, so before we head into the meat of the webinar, I just want to acknowledge that some of you may currently have a school-wide approach to vocabulary development for all learners. This is something that's quite popular, certainly in the UK at the moment, I know, and I know some international schools follow this approach too. And a school-wide approach is fantastic and something that we certainly promote. However, in regards to learners using EAL, we also need to take into consideration exactly where they are with their English language development. Because of course, there may be some children studying with us who are completely new to English, others who are starting to develop confidence, and others who are still quite fluent. So the landscape of the vocabulary development may be quite varied in your classroom. And today we're not introducing a specific program for vocabulary development, but instead we're just going to be looking at curricular subjects, whether that's math, science, history, art, or whatever, and think about vocabulary development in regards to what vocabulary students need to comprehend the curricular content they'll be studying, how to determine this, and also strategies for actually teaching it explicitly during your lessons. Okay, so let's move on to the kind of important part, really. There are so many words, all right, and how do we determine which ones to teach in any given situation? And this is a really important question if we want to explicitly teach vocabulary in our lessons. And in fact, in many ways, I think the hardest part of building vocabulary isn't necessarily knowing how to teach it, it's knowing how to plan for what vocabulary to teach. So let's look at that in a bit more detail. Okay, so one way to think about this is to consider categories of vocabulary, or what Beck et al. Called tiers of vocabulary from their work in 2002 and their book, Bringing Words to Life. You may already be familiar with this, but if not, I'm going to summarize it quickly here. And the important thing is having a way to think about the kinds of words and phrases in our lessons is going to help us to become more aware of the language demands in our particular subject or subjects. So the categories that Beck and co came up with were three. There was tier 1 words. This is everyday vocabulary and basic words that most learners know when they come to school. Now, this is in the context of learners who speak English as a first language. So what's really important in our international context is to be aware that we can't assume that our learners will know all this tier 1 of vocabulary. Okay, we hope they probably know a lot of it, especially hopefully by secondary level, but they may not. And that's particularly in the case perhaps of maybe some more culturally specific words, you know, perhaps things to do with clothing or something like that, which you know, you might be very familiar with if you've grown up in a particular culture, but if you come somewhere new, that may be different. Yeah, we can't make assumptions on those, but that's what we would expect most learners to have a good grasp of. So we probably don't want to spend loads of time on these vocabulary items unless we know there's a reason to think otherwise. Next is tier 2, and this is general academic vocabulary. This is high utility vocabulary found across the curriculum. You know, we're talking about words like describe, compare, main idea, details. Okay. And lastly, tier 3, which is domain specific vocabulary, otherwise known as kind of jargon. Basically, it's the subject specific vocabulary that carry meaning, you know, closely connected to the content. Things like carnivore, photosynthesis, magma, you know, every subject will have its own set of these. And tier 3 words are often the ones we tend to be drawn towards, as they tend to be highlighted in the curriculum, and they're also ones that may well be new to proficient language learners as well. But I would just I think the message I would like to get across is tier 2 words are really just as important, because they're the ones that will really help the students understand and engage with the material across the curriculum. And so we want to focus on fostering those as well. So having this system is as a start, but it doesn't necessarily help us identify what the key vocabulary in our lessons is. By the way, if you're not familiar with this categorization, can I recommend that you just make a quick note of tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 and what they are now? Maybe take a photo of the slide, because I will be referring to this throughout the rest of the presentation, or the rest, or certainly this section, so it might help you remember what I'm talking about. I'll give you a couple of moments if you want to do that. And as Sheila mentioned, if any questions, you can pop them in the chat and we'll address them afterwards if we can. Okay, I'm going to move on to the next slide. So identifying key vocabulary. How do I choose what to teach? Well, I think to do this, it's useful to consider 2 other principles. First, we can consider vocabulary that is useful for a better understanding of the text and the topic, the sort of key ideas, the main ideas, and that's what we can think of as vocabulary we need to know. Vocabulary to know. And secondly, we want to consider vocabulary that is useful, and this can be considered as vocabulary to go, because they can help us communicating. They can help us with communicating about the topic and about other topics in other areas as well. Often vocabulary to know relates to tier 3 and vocabulary to go relates to tier 2. So let's have a look at an example. Here's a sentence. I believe the sentence is, apologies, I think I've muddled up my slides from my previous webinar. I do apologize. Actually, I'll tell you what, I'm going to click straight on. This was an example sentence taken from a history lesson. Okay. We will investigate the contributions of ancient Mesopotamia to our local culture. And as you can see here, the highlighted parts in yellow are the bits that I thought would be most useful to teach. And that's because this is what I would call the tier 2 vocabulary in this sentence. I've chosen the chunk investigating the contributions because it's quite high register academic language. It's most likely to be encountered in writing, and you can imagine students tending to avoid this type of language and use less formal ways to explain it. They might say something like, "Oh, we're going to look at what the Mesopotamians did," and it's also a phrase that could be applied to loads of different contexts. Okay, because you could use this phrase in to talk about science or virtually any academic discipline I can imagine, to be honest. Where we want to use an academic register. So there are other words here too. And just out of interest, I would probably characterize the words in the sentence like this, with tier 1 in green, tier 2 in yellow, and tier 3 in blue. This is not, the point here, I think, is it's not to be correct in determining what's tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, because there's always gray areas, and it's going to change depending on your situation and context and educational stage and so on. But it's to help us become more aware of the language demands and just give us a sort of basic framework to start from, to move beyond the typical bolded tier 3 vocabulary that we often focus on. And sometimes it's the tier 2 words that hold the meaning of what to do, how to think about or communicate about the topic. So this is where confusion and misunderstanding can often occur around these words and lead to things like students writing completely the wrong answer or completely the wrong essay because they've just misunderstood what we're asking them to do, rather than not having an understanding of the content, which they might have a really brilliant grasp of. But again, if they don't have the language, the vocabulary in which to express that, we won't know that, will we? Okay. Other things to consider when planning then is the prior knowledge of your learners in regards to vocabulary. Obviously, a learner who is new to English is going to need more support than someone who is very competent. Some vocabulary as well only you only need to give a brief definition of or an explanation as you read or introduce the material to support comprehension. This is often the case with things like concrete nouns, where you can just flash up a picture and instantly the students will know what that is, and you can move on with it, especially if it's not a word that's likely to reoccur a lot down the line. But other vocabulary you will want to spend more time with, and as you explicitly teach it and really get the students to understand how it gets used and the nuances around it. So the other thing to consider is how many vocabulary items to teach in a lesson. And this is going to vary, but generally speaking, we think that learners are able to handle between sort of 5 to 8 vocabulary items explicitly taught over a series of lessons when we're talking about secondary learners. Any more than that's just going to be overload. Although again, there's obviously cultural, that's mediated culturally. I know there are some places where students are very adept at memorizing large amounts of information because of the way that they've sort of been educationally trained. But again, it's one thing. The important thing to stress is there's a big difference between knowing a word in terms of being able to recognize it and actually understanding how to use it in the context of the curriculum. Okay, so let's move on now to actual strategies that we can use for building vocabulary. We'll first look at an instructional routine for explicitly teaching vocabulary in our lessons. I'm going to demonstrate then a 4-step process. This comes from an example I found on wested.org, which is an organization in the United States that promotes education. And it's a general routine. And the steps are selecting vocabulary, introducing vocabulary, using vocabulary, and checking for meaning. I think this process, depending on how you approach it, is likely to take around 5 minutes per vocabulary item, maybe more as you start out and when pupils are kind of learning the routine. But at first you might feel like this is too long and you don't have time for it. But I think if we select appropriate vocabulary to teach, it can make all the difference for learners' comprehension and success with the material. And I think it's worth sort of getting a kind of your own routine that works for you and your learners, and then you can kind of reuse it quite efficiently as you move through the curriculum. So the first step is selecting vocabulary. So here's an example of how a teacher might go about doing this. So after choosing your text, in this case, the text I chose, as you saw on the previous slide, was related to the consequences and impact of climate change and global warming. So read the text and read it through for 2 things. First is to get the bigger picture and the purpose and the structure of the text. Okay, what's the kind of overall theme and idea of the text? And secondly, to circle or highlight any vocabulary items that you think might cause barriers or confusion to your learners. So again, it's not just sort of jargon words, it's also kind of what are the key concepts that the students really need to grasp in order to understand what this text is about. And if you took those words out of the text, it would really stop making any sense. And you might find it helpful to sketch a visual representation of doing this, like has been provided here. And as you go through the text, you might come up with a whole list of candidate words to teach. Okay, here's an example. Now, as we mentioned before, you probably haven't got time or resources to teach all of these in one lesson. So you want to focus on 1 or 2, and the ones that you think will have the most impact for understanding the big ideas. So here, in this case, we might decide to teach these 2 words, impact and consequence, because they kind of are the most critical for understanding the whole purpose of the text, which is the consequences and impact of global warming in the world. And also because these vocabulary items would also be useful in other contexts as well. It's not specific to this topic. They'll be really helpful in other topics too. The other words are still important, but you can address them with a brief definition or explanation as you read the text together to support comprehension. You don't need to spend a lot of time on them in this lesson necessarily. Okay, so then we need to, once we have our words, we need to demonstrate and introduce, the vocabulary. And to demonstrate this, let's take the word consequence. So first you will want to just say the word, and basically this is about what my colleague calls putting miles on the tongue, which is this idea that you can also introduce this to your students, which is the idea of saying and repeating a word and manipulating it and using it as many times as possible, so that you just get used to, they just get used to the use of it, partly just mechanically and saying it in their mouths, but also in terms of how it gets used. So they might repeat it after you, they can write it out. You might want to clap the syllables, because again, with English spelling, it's not always clear from the spelling of a word how it's pronounced. So, consequence is 3 syllables. You might want to compare it to a student's first language. Is it similar to the word in their own language? If you're a Spanish speaker, you'll immediately recognize it as consecuencia, for example. Hopefully by the end of this little stage of the lesson, the pupils will have encountered the term consequence, 15 to 20 times. They'll had a lot of exposure to it. It's really going to help them retain the language for later. The second thing, of course, is once they kind of got used to sort of producing and saying the word, is to make sure they understand what it means. Okay, and to do this, we want to give a pupil-friendly definition. And as an example, we're going to talk a little bit more about this in a moment, but be aware that a pupil-friendly definition is not the same as a dictionary definition. Dictionary definitions are often actually not all that helpful to learners using EAL, because they quite often include other words unfamiliar to the learners, or they use more complex language than the actual word itself to describe the word. There are learner dictionaries which deliberately use pupil-friendly definitions, but if you don't have one, be cautious. You can also have the pupils repeat the definition and ask other learners to give their own versions of the definition to describe it themselves, because they'll often be able to do it in a more pupil-friendly way, purely because they themselves aren't fully proficient in English. Okay. The next thing we want to do is to make connections. As we know, learning is all about making connections. So it's then giving them the chance to make the connections of the piece of vocabulary in a range of familiar contexts that they already know about. So this won't necessarily be the topic that you're teaching them about. It might be, for example, that you want to relate it to sort of everyday life type things. So, for example, we've got 3 pictures here. The consequence of eating too much sugar is bad teeth. The consequence of driving too fast is a speeding ticket. The consequence of not cleaning my room is that I can't find the book I want to read, or whatever it might be. And you might want to turn the sentence around and say something like bad teeth is a consequence of eating too much sugar, or getting a speeding ticket is a consequence of driving too quickly. So they can understand that it can be used in different ways. The final, so yeah, we've said the word, given a definition, made connections to familiar context, and the last part is making connections directly to the text or the topic in the lesson that we're teaching. So, we can relate it easily to the topic at hand. Today we're going to be reading about the consequences of global warming, and we'll look what happens when the world's temperatures rise, for example. Okay, and then this will lead in hopefully using the vocabulary. So you might, for example, want them to share an example of a consequence with their partner, and they can use the word in their example. Some plurilingual learners may well need additional support for this, so you can provide a sentence frame, something like this. And you can give them time to think about it and practice it first before turning to a partner and sharing if they need that extra support. Okay. Finally, you want to end with a way of checking for meaning, okay, which also gives more opportunities for them to practice manipulating and opportunities to see the language being used in context. So, for example, with the word consequence, perhaps a good way to do this is to come up with examples of actions and scenarios and get students to think of the consequences. You could do this by having learners work in pairs, providing each learner with a set of pictures or sentences, for example, such as this. One partner could read the sentence and the other partner simply has to give an appropriate consequence. Alternatively, if you wanted to scaffold this a little bit more with lower proficiency learners, they could match actions with consequences first before thinking of their own examples. You could give them two halves of the sentence. And of course, I've used kind of generic examples here that's sort of related to students' everyday life because it's kind of a quick way for them to get into it. But if you're working with learners who you know have got a good grasp, for example, of the subject content you're teaching, you may well want to integrate this within your subject. You can use examples from the subject that they've recently been learning about to make it more relevant to the topic that you're teaching. But the key thing is that we don't want them to be, when they're doing this kind of matching task, and you don't want them to be worried about, oh, what does this mean? Or this is a new concept to me. You want to be basing it on things that they're already comfortable with, and so that they don't have to worry about that. They're only focusing on the use of the new vocabulary that they've been given. After completing the explicit instruction, then you'll want to revisit the vocabulary as often as possible over time. As we know, this is a really great way of reinforcing learning, and you can do this in many ways. So you could have the pupils highlight the vocabulary during reading. We could also have pupils add words to their own glossaries, such as this little example here, and this could include the use of their first language for reference if helpful. And you could also do this by using, sort of gap fill exercises after reading, as we've seen that, you can provide them with a frame for doing that. Another fun activity that you can do after reading is to give cards to each group. And you can give 4 cards, one with one that includes the beginning letter of the word, one with the last letter, one with the number of syllables, and finally one with a definition. So pupils will read these out in turn and aren't allowed to share their guesses until after the full definition has been read. So this is a good way of reviewing, a lot of new vocabulary that you've got. You can create cards for each new word that you've been looking at. Finally, just look for opportunities as well to use and recycle the vocabulary in other situations when you're just going about your teaching in the lesson, or even outside the lesson, depending on if you're interacting with the students. So just using the word in other contexts, like this teacher. What will be the consequence if you don't do your homework? We're dropping in the language so that they get to hear it in other situations. Okay, so here's a task for you to think about now. We also want our learners to develop what we call word consciousness, which we spoke about before. So let's take a quick minute here to think about how you might foster word knowledge or word awareness for pupils using the word consequence. And I don't mean necessarily just the meaning of the word. I mean, what do you notice about the parts of this word, its history or its links to other meanings? So in the chat, just write down sort of anything that comes to you. Alan, that's a good suggestion to begin with. Definitely. Nicole, the connotation, that's a useful. Okay. Yeah, sequence of the word, break up the word. Okay. Yeah, some good suggestions coming through. I see that someone's put con as a negative as well. That's interesting. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Impact another meaning. Okay. Syllable count. Okay. These are loads of fantastic ideas coming through. Wow, Felicia's French words used in English. Okay, this is fantastic. This is the beauty of having an international audience, I think, with these kind of things, because you get a really broad range of linguistic connections. Okay, fantastic. All right, so I think you guys have already sort of done the hard work here. That you've put some fantastic suggestions down, but the idea here is absolutely to help learners develop a sense of word knowledge, and this includes things like prefixes and suffixes, morphemes, which is the sort of smallest part of a word that you can kind of detach from it and still have it retain meaning. In this case, it would be con with sequence. Con would be the prefix. So con and sequence would be the morphemes. And this can help learners because it will help them figure out the meanings of words more independently. Because if they understand that the morpheme con, the prefix con, can mean with or together, then this might help them understand these kind of words when they encounter other examples, such as contract or contrast and these things. Like you also have con meaning negative. That's true, but this is different in this case. This is not a negative. This doesn't have a negative connotation in this particular example. And of course, we'll have the word sequence in there, which again is a separate word on its own, and students will probably be quite familiar with because they have to do lots of kind of sequencing type tasks in their educational lives often. And yeah, we have other words that might relate to it, which we can tell them about too, if we wanted to expand their understanding. Again, this will depend on their level of proficiency. We don't want to overwhelm students, so you kind of need to take into account where your students are and what they're able to deal with. Okay, so another quick task for you. Write your answer in the chat. Add a prefix or a suffix, so prefixes before, suffixes after, to this word to change its meaning. Interesting. Okay, some good examples. Some, yeah, great examples coming through. Sequel's an interesting one. With adding a letter. Equalize. Okay, lovely. Yeah, so I mean, I think a lot of you have provided, here are some examples. But as you can see, you know, from this one root, there's all these other words that stem from it, and that's really useful to draw learners' attention to, because again, it's just going to help them, especially in kind of academic writing, make those connections and understand and recognize those words when they encounter them. You know, we don't necessarily expect them to be able to use all these words themselves, although it would be great if they do, but the initial stage is at least being able to recognize them and understand them. And then of course, as they get more confident in their written and spoken English, they hopefully can move on to using a broader range of vocabulary too. So yeah, so that by giving them one word like that, we can help them guess the meaning of loads of other words. So again, this is kind of the thing we're looking out for when we're choosing which words to teach. Words like this, which have a really large crossover into other words, are always going to be really helpful for our learners. Okay. Another thought or tip before moving on is helping you to come up with pupil-friendly definitions, because it sounds really easy. Just give a pupil-friendly definition. But it's actually quite a hard thing to do if you've ever tried to do it. And it takes a lot of practice. And remember, we don't really want to rely on dictionary definitions because they're not usually very helpful for doing this. So a couple of tips is if the word is, well, I mean, one thing is, if the word's a noun, in a lot of cases, you can really easily just show a picture. If you can show a picture or do an action or show it in some way, do that. It's always the easiest thing. But if it's more abstract, such as a verb, then you might want to make a sentence like this. So if you something, you do this. So you're relating it directly to the student in this way. So if you modify something, you change it a little, usually to make it better. If you let's just say classify, not classify. If you classify things, you organize them into groups based on their attributes. If you justify something, you explain why it is reasonable or good or appropriate. And this will help you limit the words you use in creating a definition. It provides a routine structure for giving definitions, which will reduce the cognitive load for learners so they can concentrate more on the meaning. And using it connects a definition to your pupil so they can relate to it better as well. So that's for verbs. If you have adjectives, then you might want to do something like this. Someone who is, and then we can give an example. Someone who is impressive makes you think, wow, because they are really good at something. Someone who is capable is very good at doing things. And you can make it more specific given the context. Something that is significant is very important, or whatever it might be. And where possible, always try to give examples rather than just giving an isolated definition of a word. If you can put it into context, it's always going to be more meaningful. And this is where things like asking questions can be really useful. So, can you tell me someone who is impressive? Tell me, give me an example of somebody who is capable in your family, that kind of thing, and you can check that they're understanding. Another strategy that is very useful for learners using AL is knowing how to recognize and use clues in the text that indicate definitions of vocabulary or concepts. Many school texts use the same kinds of structures to provide pupil-friendly definitions. So, for example, they will use is, something is called, is referred to as in these examples. They might use that is, marginal lands, that is, and then the definition. They could also use parentheses and dashes to do this as well. So by teaching learners kind of these recurring structures and approaches, it's going to really help them understand their texts. We should also teach learners how to use glossaries that are found in texts and in grade level dictionaries, including bilingual dictionaries and online reference materials as well. So that's all part of building independence. Okay, our next approach then is a functional approach, and this helps us to identify key vocabulary by having us look at the functional purpose of the text and using this as the tool for determining which vocabulary we want to teach. So to demonstrate this, I'm going to use this text on how honey is made. So quickly read the text here, and as you do, think about what the purpose of the text is, what it's doing, and what its function is. Okay, so I imagine most of you have come up with the idea that this is an explanation of some kind. Okay, in this case, it's an explanation of a natural phenomenon, and it's providing the steps for how honey is made. Now, when we're considering function, it's going to really help us understand how we want to present vocabulary. So for a sequential explanation like this, let's imagine you're going to create a vocabulary aid for your students, a word mat. Which word mat would be better to use and why, A or B? And just type your answer in the chat. Okay, a lot of consensus in people's answers. Why have you chosen B? Exactly. It's explaining the process, isn't it? It follows the sequence of the explanation, and that is the functional main purpose of the text. So it connects directly to the function of the text. It includes both tier 2 and tier 3 words. So there's quite rich examples of vocabulary there, and it supports learners in using the vocabulary, and it would allow them to, retell the explanation. Also, what's important is that it uses vocabulary in phrases instead of individual words, which helps to provide context. And as a language teacher, this is something I would sort of, really try and emphasize, is when you're thinking about vocabulary, try not to think about it in terms of individual words, and try and think about it more in terms of chunks of language. What chunks of language are going to help the students, especially once we move beyond, beginner level, working with students who have got some proficiency in English. It's more useful to get them to think about chunks than individual words in many cases. And we'll move on, we'll talk about that in a bit more detail in a minute. So yeah, so a helpful tip is obviously to arrange your visuals and vocabulary based on the structure and purpose of the text. It's going to really support the learners to understand it. This is whether the text is spoken or written. You want to add images and vocabulary, where you add images, and vocabulary together where you can. And you can have students also do creative things with the text. So, retell them, turn them into their own graphic organizers or own. They can organize it in a way that makes sense for themselves. They can create posters or drawings. And of course, you could also have them turn them into things like word walls or graphic organizers for their own reference or for use on the classroom display. One thing to avoid certainly and to move away from is simply providing a long list of individual words, because it's just not very useful for students. It doesn't help them really understand how words are used, and it's not going to help them when they see them in the future. Okay, so again, another very quick task, going back to our honey text. If you wanted learners to be able to retell or later explain on their own how honey is made, what other vocabulary would you want to highlight for learners to do this? So I'm thinking especially about kind of tier 2 language, not necessarily the jargon specific stuff. So yes, words like honeycomb and nectar, beekeeper, but what other words would be useful? Okay. Yeah, some people here using discourse markers is sort of clever way to say kind of words for talking about the sequence of events here. Identifying verbs and nouns could be a starting point, depending on the level of your students, but I think it's in terms of teaching vocabulary, that's more about raising awareness of grammar. Time conjunctions, yeah, I agree with you there. Phrasal verb might be useful to, yeah, to draw their attention to, certainly, because they're often quite challenging. I mean, my suggestion would be, obviously there's no particular right or wrong answer, it will depend on your students, but I think if we're looking at this as considering the function of the text, which is as a sequential explanation, the most important language is the language that links the sequences together. And we've highlighted the various time connectives here that help learners retell the sequence, the first step, after, then, and so on. So making vocabulary word walls with examples of time connectives, for example, is a really useful tool, because this is language that will recur again and again in all kinds of different areas, and you can have learners add to them over time as they come up with their own ideas or see new examples. So this is something to think about. This isn't a task per se. This is just something for you to take away. Some considerations. So take just a minute to think about these. And basically, we don't really have time to do this now, but this is the type of thinking you should be doing when you're planning vocabulary support for your learners. So again, this is one to kind of take note of and store away for later. And here's an example of what kind of thing we're talking about. So there's an example from a history context, but one of the functions we need students to be able to use is to communicate modality or degree of certainty. Okay, so they might want to be, you know, some things when you're talking about history, you're speaking with a very low degree of certainty. Other things you're speaking with a very high degree of certainty, depending on, you know, all the evidence and the information available to you. And also you're often talking perhaps about predictions about the future as well in a historical context. So these kind of words are very useful. And again, you can model this or have pupils categorize and add their own ideas, which can later to be referred to. You might want to begin this with a sort of empty table or a table with just one or two examples, and you get the students to add them as they build up. You should always kind of try and draw the language out from the students first. And of course, this is going to help the learners using AL better understand the sometimes subtle differences between these words as well. So again, you're always thinking about the language and vocabulary learners are going to need to use and how to highlight and model these for the students, kind of make it kind of clear and visual for them. Okay, and our final approach, I realize we haven't got a lot of time, but it should only take a few minutes, is to look at what we can do in terms of classroom talk. And this is really getting them to understand, getting our students to have more opportunities to use new vocabulary and giving them as many opportunities to get those miles on the tongue as possible. And again, this concept has quite strong implications for curriculum planning and for how we plan lessons with vocabulary in mind. So although group work may be considered more of an indirect approach to building vocabulary, to be effective, it really requires careful planning. So if we're doing some kind of extended talk, discussion, the aim is to design activities where extended talk is necessary for the task, and where key vocabulary is being revisited numerous times throughout the discussion. So let's take an example, for example, from maths. So this is what we could call a successive pair share. I'm sure most of you are familiar with the concept of a pair share, where the students discuss something in pairs and then they share it with the wider group. And so here the teacher provides an equation for pupils to solve independently, so they do it on their own. And then with a partner, each student shares the steps they used to reach the solution. After hearing what worked for their classmate, each student has a chance to revise their own work based on what they heard. So if they've got different answers, they might, oh, okay, one of these is probably right, one of these is wrong, and they figure it out. And then the process continues and the students share the new version of the equation with a new partner. get more feedback from the new partner, and then they can return and they can edit their work further, and the process can continue until they finally get they can get sort of plenary feedback from the teacher. This provides opportunities to practice and repeat academic vocabulary in context. Okay, so learners may start with vague and incomplete proofs, and through ideas from their classmates, they solidify their own proofs and gain a better understanding of how to use key vocabulary needed in their explanations, which again is going to be particularly useful. It's going to be useful for all learners, but it's going to be particularly useful for learners using EAL because it just gives them that repetitive opportunity to use the language and kind of finesse it. Another very sort of simple idea is always, sometimes, never. So here the teacher provides a number of related statements, and the group has to decide, or small pairs, or small groups or pairs if you want, if the statement is always, sometimes, or never true. For example, linear equations have slope. I'm not a maths teacher, so I actually have no idea what the answer to any of these is, but this is a kind of task which will promote discussion. And again, by discussing it, they have to use the language in the sentence, most likely. So we're promoting their use of the probably sort of tier 3 vocabulary and the tier 2 vocabulary as well that appears in these kind of sentences. And of course, they can also justify their decisions, and they can use drawings, graphs, and equations to support their conversation. And since the statements are related, vocabulary items are going to be used and repeated often. So you don't want to do this with a list of completely random sentences. You're doing it with a list of sentences that are all related to a single topic. And in fact, building in opportunities for students to compare, justify, and analyze answers in pairs before feeding back will be of benefit for all learners, but especially learners with the AL, because it gives them a chance to practice and use key vocabulary, but B, it also gives them the extra time that they need to formulate a response before having to offer it out to the class, which can be very intimidating. So again, you're giving them the thinking time and the space, but you're also giving them the opportunities to produce the language. And lastly, don't expect students to be able to discuss things kind of without support. And this probably goes for proficient speakers of English as well as learners using EAL. And we all know what it's like when we say, okay, discuss a topic, and then the room falls silent and the conversations all dry up. Well, one way to get around this obviously is to provide support. So here's a highly scaffolded discussion support that walks learners through a conversation with check marks to tick as they talk along the way. And it's important to keep in mind that learners who are lower proficiency or new to English, they can be extremely competent in the subject content knowledge. So, they may be, brilliant at maths, and very, very good at solving maths problems, but they just don't have the English that they need to explain the processes. So by allowing them to use things like visuals and drawings and charts to justify their answers, you're going to break down that communication barrier and make them feel more valued and more able to contribute in the classroom. Okay, almost finished. So lastly, in terms of further resources, I just want to mention some things we can do to support vocabulary specifically related to assessment, formal assessment, so exams and essays and things like that. So here is a list of tips, and again, we will be sharing some of the links that we're providing here. So teaching the meaning of instruction words is really important, because that's what, if they don't, even no matter how good their content knowledge is, if they don't understand the question, they're not going to succeed. Again, make it clear the difference between questions and instructions. They're not the same thing. And give them opportunities to review, remember, and practice using these words themselves, because that's how they're going to become better able to understand them when they see them in an exam context, is by using them first themselves. They can do things like highlight instruction words when they read exam papers. There's a useful article here, which again, we'll send you the link to tomorrow, so don't worry about it. And also in Ireland, they've got a really interesting website set up to help students with exams in Ireland, which is specific to to the Irish education system, but it has lots of generic stuff in there, which is helpful too. So I include it for that reason. And lastly, this is just a collection again of other resources that the foundation has on our website and on other websites and resources that we found useful. And we'll send you these links in the email we send tomorrow. So that's everything from me. Thank you for listening. And Sheila, were there any questions? I know we don't have a lot of time, but if there's any, I'm happy to stick around for another minute or two.
That's great, Tom, again, and thank you for such a practical and really useful webinar. That was wonderful. But at this point, we do not have any questions in the question and answer chat here.
Oh, we must have covered everything.
I think you did. I think you did, and we are right on time. So unless anybody has a last-minute question to put in the chat box, even or the Q&A, I think we will maybe move on. Before leaving today, I do want to just also share with you that the Bell Foundation does have some timely webinars and guidance information on our website that regards welcoming refugee and asylum seeking learners. I think a lot of us right now are around the world, but particularly in Europe here too, are receiving refugees from Ukraine. And so we do have information on that, as well as some really useful webinars about the Ukrainian education system and how to welcome new arrivals. So those would be really useful to you if this is a situation that you are experiencing where you are right now as well. So please go ahead and visit us there. Just a quick reminder, we will be sending you a link tomorrow of the webinar and the recording of that. So you'll get that as an email. And also right at the end of the webinar, you will be receiving a course evaluation. It will appear, and we do ask you to please take a minute to just fill that out, because it does help us with our own development, and your feedback is important to us. So I think that's it for today. Thank you very much for taking part in this with us, and we look forward to seeing you in the future.
Yes, thank you, everyone. Bye.
Bye-bye.